Qasim, can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear. How are you?
Oh, I'm very well, sir. How are you?
I'm fantastic.
That's good. Well,
Thanks for
listen,
asking.
thank you so much for agreeing to come onto the show.
No, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. Well, we got a lot of questions that kind of roll into one. But first of all, I kind of very briefly outlined a little about you. You're an Islamic educator, an author, an attorney, and a human rights activist. Clearly quite busy. I'm going to imagine
I
that
keep
takes up
busy.
your time.
Yeah, wonderfully married, three beautiful kids. So I definitely stay busy. Absolutely.
You don't like sleep. That's not your thing. I get it. I get it. Now, since 2001, 2001 really, isn't it? There's been an explosion of interest and demonization of Muslims in general, partly due to activities carried out by people claiming to do it in the name of Islam or doing it in the name of Islam. And of course, people not perhaps being around a lot of Muslims, so therefore only knowing about them from what they read.
hmm
Just before we get into it, I'm probably going to mispronounce this terribly. You're from a particular branch or sect of Islam called Ahmadiyya. Is that correct?
You pronounce it perfectly. Absolutely. Yep.
Check me out. What an expert. Could you tell us just a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, the Ahmadiyya Muslim community are Muslims who believe in the Messiah Mirza Ghulam Ahmad of Qadian. Uh, Muslims in general, regardless of their sect, believe that in the latter days a Messiah will come to revive Islam and to reform Muslims. Much of the orthodoxy believes that Jesus will physically descend from heaven. We reject this completely. We say that it's contrary to the Quran, it's contrary to logic, it's contrary to science. We believe that Mirza Ghulam Ahmad was that awaited Messiah who would come to reform Muslims, revive Islam peacefully with education and with dialogue. And to that end, the Ahmadiyya Muslim community was established in 1889, about 130 years ago, and has since expanded peacefully to over 200 nations worldwide. We are united under a caliph, which is surprising for people to hear because the only caliph, so-called caliph they've heard about is that terrorist who leads Daesh, ISIS, whatever you want to call them. But His Holiness, the Khalifa of Islam, Mirza Masroor Ahmad, he resides in the United Kingdom, and he oversees this community of tens of millions of Muslims all around the world. And what I would submit to your viewers is that factually speaking, this is the single largest sect of Islam united under one imam in the world. But you haven't heard of this yet because peaceful Muslims don't make headlines the way terrorists do.
No. And can I just ask? I'm certainly not a scholar on Islam, but the Shiites and the Sunnis and the other sort of Wahhabi sect, how do they feel about your particular sect of Islam?
There's immense persecution in countries like Pakistan. There's state sanctioned being arrested or thrown in prison or even being killed. Just a couple days ago, a prominent Ahmadi Muslim lawyer was killed in cold blood because of his faith. Indonesia, which has long been a beacon of tolerance, is unfortunately succumbing to some of these extremists who are persecuting Ahmadi Muslims. In Algeria, we're being arrested. In most Arab states, we suffer censorship and persecution. And people use that as an excuse to say, oh, well, look, Islam is violent. And if they only reflected at how ignorant of a statement that is, they would retract that statement. The reality is that these regimes that are persecuting Ahmadi Muslims aren't doing so because they're following Islam. They're doing so because they're political regimes. They have corrupt leadership, and they can't uphold their argument with logic and facts. So all they have left is censorship. I don't know of anyone who respects a government or considers them a legitimate authority when they rule by censorship. You know, for Americans we love our free speech. We love freedom of expression. And so what I would submit to Americans is that when you look at these governments that are persecuting the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, recognize that these governments are doing so not because they have a logical rebuttal to us, it's because they don't. And as a result, our proven model of Islam is a threat to their existence. This frightens them. And so their only consequence, their only response is to try to censor us and violently persecute us. But on the contrary, for over 100 years now, 130 years, we've continued to grow peacefully, progressively, and we've produced some of the world's greatest scholars. The first Muslim scientist to win a Nobel Prize was an Ahmadiyya Muslim, Dr. Abdus Salam. The first president of the UN General Assembly was a Muslim who belonged to the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. We've had directors of the World Bank. We've had actors. We've had Oscar winners, Grammy Award winners. This is not in spite of Islam. This is because of Islam, and that's the message I want to drive home.
Okay. Before we came up with the tag of the likes of Daesh, Al-Qaeda, and others of extremist, we used to refer to them as fundamentalist. It was always Islamic fundamentalism. Extremism is quite a recent word, as if that it's an extreme interpretation. Now, I know the common argument is that the Old Testament is full of absolute horror stories, and we know that it's a product of its time. And you quite famously challenge a lot of people's quotes of the Quran that do seem to us to be quite horrific. Now, one of the problems that you'll face is one of the things that came up when I said we were going to have you on is instantly the idea of taqiyya. Again, I hope I pronounced that correctly, came up. So instantly you're put in a position where obviously everything you say to me this evening, as I'm sure you're aware to some people, is actually just a ruse because secretly you're going to get angry and explode at us at some point. How do you get your message across about what sounds to me in layman's terms to be quite almost like a reformation of a religion? That's how it sounds to me as an outsider. How do you get that across when faced with the fact that we do have all these verses from the Quran? We are seeing all these people carrying out atrocities that they say are in line with their religious teachers from the Quran. When you're up against this, how basically, I guess what I'm asking is, how do we move forward and show that it isn't this damaging, hateful, spiteful religion?
Sure. So there's a lot to unpack here. First, let me address this idea of whether we are reviving Islam or reforming Islam. And I want to be very clear that the Ahmadiyya Muslim community is reviving Islam. We believe that the Islam taught by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, does not need reform. It is Muslims who are distorting and misrepresenting the teachings of Islam and Muhammad, peace be upon him, and it is those Muslims who need reform. So everything that we've accomplished over 130 years, we've built 16,000 mosques, we've built nearly 1,000 secular educational institutions, we've built dozens of hospitals, and these schools give free education to children of all faiths, these hospitals give free healthcare to people of all faiths. This is all as a result of adhering to the Quran and to the example of the Prophet of Islam. So right off the bat, a proven model goes further than any empty theory or argument could, because you're showing by example well over a century of peace, of progress, and never a single act of terrorism. Despite vehement persecution in the worst conceivable, imaginable form, we've never engaged in a single act of terrorism. That's not an accident. That is because we have a proven model of success. Second point about this taqiyya concept. You notice I laughed when you brought that up. I wasn't laughing at you. I was laughing at the people who think that this has anything to do with Islam. You can search the Quran. You can search all the authentic books of hadith, and you will not find this word anywhere whatsoever. The Quran is absolutely clear, unequivocal, that you cannot hide the truth, you cannot evade the truth, you cannot distort the truth. You must speak truth in all situations. So this idea that you can somehow speak a lie to get some kind of advantage over your neighbors and then take over, it's nonsense, it's ridiculous. But furthermore, think about what this position says. It's essentially a form of censorship. It says, I'm not going to listen to you and I'm going to suppress what you say because of a preconceived notion. People who believe in this nonsense are no different than extremists who refuse to let an opposing point of view speak because they're afraid that if they let an opposing point of view speak, it's going to prove them wrong intellectually, it's going to prove them wrong logically. So I think this is beneath the dignity of a human being, it's beneath the dignity of any kind of society. Now, your final point about these allegedly violent verses. See, part of the problem with these fundamentalists, with these extremists, is not only do they have no knowledge of the Quran, but when they read the Quran, they get to pick and choose what they want to use. And unfortunately for them, the Quran already preempted them and told them why they are perverse and perverted. In chapter 3, verse 8 of the Quran, God says clearly that you must accept the whole book, every single verse. And then it goes on to say that in this book there are two types of verses. Those that are muqamat, which means they're decisive in meaning, they form the foundation of the Quran, and those that are mustashabihat, which means they are open to interpretation. But then the Quran says something really remarkable. It says, in those hearts that has a perversity, that are perverted, they will try to find the violent interpretations. So before you had any concept of so-called Islamic terrorism, you had the Quran saying, by the way, yes, there are verses open to interpretation, and the people who have a perverted heart will find the violent interpretations. Why? Because they're perverted. So when I look at what people like ISIS are doing, and I look at the Islamophobes who are trying to claim that ISIS has some kind of legitimate authority, I go back to what the Quran preemptively said, that these people are perverted and they have nothing to do with the Quran. What those verses actually permit, getting to the final answer, is in the Quran, and this is going to sound controversial to some people, but Islam is not a pacifistic religion. It is a religion that teaches justice, personal peace, and national and international peace. And sometimes to maintain peace, you need to have rules of engagement if somebody attacks you. What the Quran permits is that if you are persecuted for your faith, you leave your home, you're exiled to a different country, and then you're pursued to be killed, at that point in time, you are permitted to fight in self-defense. Except it's not just for yourself. You have to fight for churches, for synagogues, and for temples. This is not my interpretation. This is literally chapter 22, verse 40 and 41 of the Quran, where Muslims are commanded to stand up and fight against those terrorists who are attacking churches and temples and synagogues and mosques. And it is to those people who are attacking you because of your faith after exiling you that the Quran says, yes, you may kill such terrorists in self-defense. But then the Quran goes on to say that even at that last moment, if they desist, then you must also desist. What ISIS terrorists do is they miss the entire part about fighting in self-defense. They cherry pick one verse to fulfill their perverted egos, and then they commit acts of atrocity and horror. So there's nothing violent in the Quran. The Quran is a very just book because it teaches the right to self-defense of universal freedom of conscience. It is my obligation as a Muslim to fight to defend the right of an atheist to non-belief. Because if you can't support the right of people to believe what their conscience tells them, then you don't believe in freedom of conscience. And the Quran is a book that is absolutely clear that freedom of conscience cannot be violated, it cannot be oppressed.
So, would it be fair to say, and again, feel free to correct me wherever you think I might be wrong, obviously.
This is great.
But would you be prepared to say that, going by your interpretation of the Quran, which obviously I do not have an all-encompassing knowledge of, that what we see as the Sunni and Shia with the mass slaughters that happen between them alone, the external terrorism, Daesh, all claiming to follow the Quran entirely is, as you put it, a perversion based on their own egos, but also perhaps a lot of the problems we're encountering, even in this country, because it isn't plain sailing when cultures always come together, that there is a lot of cultural issues from infecting the religion, as it were. So, because we all know that region of the world, although I believe the Quran is Muslims believe the Quran is the absolute word of God.
Right.
But there will still be various interpretations based upon those words that will have cultural issues that come from before that time, the nomadic nature, the warlike, sort of more warlike nomadic tribes, perhaps gravitating towards it. Are we seeing that due to the massive growth in areas where there isn't open access perhaps to education, to information, to outside cultures, that when they come together, we are seeing that perversion amplified several times, especially when we do also go into these countries and, well, invade them, to be fair?
Yeah, I mean, I like your question because it speaks to nuance. And one thing that you don't find among anti-Muslim personalities or among groups like ISIS is you don't find nuance. For every answer, it's just a black and white issue, and there's no other conceivable explanation. I already spoke to the levels of censorship in a lot of these countries, and when you have censorship, you have a very difficult time promoting education. One thing that every study has found that studies extremism is that a strong education in Islam is the best defense against extremism, a best defense against terrorism. By understanding what the Quran means, you have a much stronger chance of preventing terrorism in the first place. There were those ISIS recruits that were caught buying Islam for dummies. I mean, these guys have no idea what they're talking about. But I would say that you can really pinpoint the problems down to two broad issues and then many minor issues underneath there as well. The two broad issues are you have a failure in Muslim leadership. You have Muslim leadership that is behaving unjustly, that is promoting these draconian laws, people like Saddam Hussein, people like dictator Ziaul Haq, people like Assad, that are effectively destroying Muslim communities from within. And then you have a compounding factor with unjust foreign interventionism, things like the Iraq War, that people don't realize have killed up to 1 million Iraqi civilians. Things like what we just saw happen 2 weeks ago where U.S. allied forces killed 200 Iraqi civilians. Just last week, another 100 Syrian civilians were killed by gas, and nobody even knows what happened or why. So when you have these kinds of foreign interventions combined with corrupt Muslim leadership, yeah, of course, you're going to have extremism spread. You're going to have terrorism spread. To blame a religion that preceded all that is simply bonkers. It's nonsense. One data point that really exemplifies this is that before the invasion of Iraq in 2003, there were 0 suicide bombings in Iraq. Now, this is not a support of Saddam Hussein because ultimately he was a dictator that the United States government and our taxes also funded and trained and supported. But it goes to show that the suicide bombings that have begun after that, and I think there's over 2,000 now in the last 14 years, that those are not the result of religious warfare. That's the result of nationalism. That's the result of you have an entire generation of people raised without a functioning government, and they're resorting to anarchy and chaos. I pray to God my country, America, remains safe always. But it's human nature that if somebody attacks you, if some foreign government, God forbid, attacked the United States, you better believe that Americans would pick up arms and fight back. I don't know any American that would just sit down, lying down, and not worry about a foreign country invading. You wouldn't blame Christianity for that. You would recognize that Americans don't want to be invaded and they're going to fight back. That's human nature. And that's what's happening in Iraq, for example. You have this terrorist group, ISIS, that is a terrorist group, but as Dr. Robert Pape of the University of Chicago points out, that the vast majority of suicide bombings, over 95%, are nationalistic. They're not religious. And it's important to understand that because when you blindly blame religion and ignore the actual root cause, then you have no way of remediating it. But right now, we've been bombing Iraq for 30, 35 years. You can't expect people to not be angry and upset when you've bombed their homeland for 30, 35 years. And if you think that's unreasonable, then God help any Western nation that is bombed and the victims that come from it, because that is what creates radicals. It's not religion. It's by bombing innocent people.
It's actually what pushes people, makes it easier for those who do have an agenda and might use religion for it to gain people. It's one thing that concerns me in this country where we do have some issues. We genuinely do with, some mosques are not perhaps giving the best message to the young people. Perhaps it's better to say certain imams. We do have a problem in prison where people are being radicalized to a great degree and come out proclaiming that they are using the absolute word of God to punish everybody else. We've had a documentary about Muslims in this country that want to see Sharia law for the whole of Britain, that would happily watch people beheaded. And these guys are saying it quite openly because you still can in this society. So we do have these problems, and the main problem I've got is if I speak out about this, we've got a terrible situation now where, never mind political correctness or anything of that nature, My concern is that if we move to counter this, how many of the Muslims that I've been around, I live in a tremendously multicultural city, by the way. It's not a boast, it's just how it is. We see the best and worst in all people here. So, it's nothing new. It's not like saying, some of my best friends are black. I just happen to have some Muslim friends. It's just how it is. And I've made point on this show, not one of them has exploded around me to date. Not even when he's annoyed, and not even when he said Allahu Akbar, which I'm assured by the internet is the trigger word to cause explosion.
Evidently.
I've seen it. It's how it works.
Yeah.
It's wonderful that your sect has this, the correct, as you say, interpretation of the Quran and it's not all about violence. But I think the problem we face at the moment is, whilst you are tens of millions in number and hopefully growing, because even as an atheist, I'd far rather see peaceful religious religions going on. We're up against something that's far more dangerous. This is mostly why I wanted to have you on. I could possibly have reached out to somebody much more aggressive, not Anjem Chowdhury, because he's in prison now, but someone of that nature. That would have been very easy, and get him here, and I could sit here shouting about how dare he want to stone women and cut hands off and things of that nature.
And this is the thing. I mean, and this is where people often try to ridicule me and say, Muslims are persecuting you. Why are you defending them? Muslims aren't the issue. The 1.6 billion Muslims on earth aren't the issue. I can tell you, I interact with Shia Muslims, Sunni Muslims all the time on a daily basis. They're not the issue. The issue, and I'm being very, very surgical here, are corrupt leadership. People like Anjem Chowdhury and terrorists like him. And they're aggravated by ignorant people like Tommy Robinson who think he has a shred of knowledge about Islam. The two extreme sides feed into one another. And that's why it's so problematic. That's why it's so much more important for us to work together. The Khalifa of Islam, His Holiness Mirza Masroor Ahmad, leads by example. Just 2 weeks ago, he awarded a woman for her work in nuclear disarmament at the International Peace Prize, and spoke harshly against the international arms trade, and made very clear that this is what's causing the terrorism that we're seeing. We need to stop funding these proxy wars. This is a very practical, very logical, very secular answer. And, under his guidance, we've launched the True Islam Education Campaign. Your viewers can check it out at trueislam.com. And this education campaign is designed to arm people with the information they need to push back against extremism and against Islamophobia. We've had nearly 15,000 people sign up as a Muslim ally. And so while you're right, I feel the frustration you have, because it's something I live every single day. But our position is that we've had immense success over the last 130 years through these very logical, very casual conversations, through interaction, through service to humanity, blood drives, food drives. That's what needs to continue to push back against the narratives of ignorance and fear. It's not going to be a quick fix. It took us 30, 40 years of bombing Iraq to get to ISIS. It's not going to be resolved overnight. It will take time, and it will require us to work together. But we need to be relentless in that unity against extremism.
But that's the problem, isn't it? We live in a McDonald's, I want it now or in 5 minutes. Time when other things take generations. When I talk about the Israel-Palestine issue, and everyone screams it's been 70 years, why isn't it fixed? What's that in history? We've got two people that don't like each other. These things take time. I do have several questions and points that have come from users, so I'd like to put those sort of to you. I've had to condense a few because many of them were much the same or slightly different worded. A couple of them are to do with Muslims and Jews, actually, and this one is to do with Muhammad. This is from a member called Justin, who says, in Muhammad's life, he went around killing Jews. He was a warlord, and mentions the invasion of, another word I'll probably maim, Banu Qurayza. So was Muhammad a warlord, or was he a spiritual leader, or both?
So the entire question is based off a false assumption. Okay. What he's referring to is the Battle of the Ditch, when the Muslims had formed an alliance with the Jews of Medina. The Prophet of Islam established not Sharia law, he established the Charter of Medina. This was a secular document that preceded the Magna Carta by 600 years. It was a constitution that guaranteed religious freedom, equality of Muslims and Jews, and it formed a military alliance that if the state of Medina were to be attacked by outside forces, then the Muslims and Jews would form an alliance against that external attack. You know, very simple, very basic concept. This is written, I think there's 47 articles in this document. You can find it online right now. During the attack, the state of Medina was attacked, and the army of Muslims and Jews was only about 1,200. They were facing an external army of about 18,000. And through a remarkable military strategy, the state of Medina was victorious in their battle. And you can read about it, and you should read about it. However, during the battle, the Banu Qurayza, who had signed on to this constitution, committed treason. And they revolted against the Muslims and the other Jewish tribes. Fortunately, they were able to overcome the mutiny, overcome the treason, the Muslim and Jewish tribes, and were able to stop this revolt. Now, after the war was over, the question was, what should be done with this tribe? They had committed treason, and as we know, the punishment for treason is what? It's capital punishment. The Prophet of Islam had not yet issued his verdict. The Banu Qurayza said to him that we will not accept your verdict, but if you let us choose our judge, then we will accept that verdict, whatever our judge chooses. The Prophet said, okay, I agree to those terms. You can choose your judge, and I will bind myself to whatever your judge chooses. What's also remarkable about this is that the Banu Qurayza had committed treason once before, and the Prophet had not executed them, had not given any kind of capital punishment on them. So this was the second time committing this treason. Well, so the Banu Qurayza picked their own judge. Their judge said, well, you're Jews, and according to the Torah, the punishment for treason is capital punishment. Therefore, you are going to be judged according to your own book, according to your own acts. Even then, those Jews who asked the Prophet for forgiveness the Prophet said to them, you have my forgiveness. I have no issue with you. But those who refused were then held accountable to their own judge, according to their own law, according to their own acts. Now, to attribute any of that to the Prophet of Islam is simply ridiculous. But even beyond that, there's a phenomenal book written by Dr. Barakat Ahmad called Muhammad and the Jews, where he analyzes the historical evidences of this and goes into this amazing scholarly research to demonstrate that in all probability, this so-called mass execution didn't even happen. One, there's no record of it in Jewish history. Two, there's no record of there ever being any kind of a mass grave. And three, just from a physiological health standpoint, it would have been impossible to execute 800 people in Medina without disease and famine spreading. But see, this is the problem with Islamophobes and extremists. They're not willing to do the research and the deep investigation. They want to find a meme, they want to do Google scholarship, and they want to spew this nonsense and create more fear and misunderstanding.
Well, when you look at the whole
story...
Sorry to interrupt you there. It's just, as much as we mentioned the McDonald's generation, people read headlines now.
Yeah.
We don't read stories, we read headlines, preferably tweets.
That's exactly it.
And preferably something we can call someone a liberal snowflake for. That's how people shut me down. With you, it's taqiyya. With me, it's being a liberal snowflake. You know.
I get that too. So.
Oh God, you're getting the full set then. We've got some more questions. This one again. Sure. This one's from Happy Dog, and it relates to Jews and Muslims again, and some other things. I'll read his whole question. I'm going to skip some other questions about your prophet and paedophilia, because as far as I know, everyone was bang at it in those days. People only lived for about 30 years, so I think that's kind of a non-issue, just used to beat people over the head with. But Happy Dog says, why has Islam always had a problem with Judaism? The Quran mentions the Jews more times than Hitler did in Mein Kampf, and it is equivalent to the book of Revelations says at the end of times, even the rocks and trees will call out, there is a Jew hiding, come kill him. Can Islam ever accept a world that is not theist-based, where Jews, women and gays are free and equal with Muslim men? And he says, thank you.
Now, important questions. The Islam that Prophet Muhammad taught said that all humanity is equal. And there's no asterisks to that. These assumptions of Islam being anti-Semitic are, again, founded in ignorance. I can cite two important resources to look at. One is by a Christian scholar, Dr. Philip Jenkins, called Laying Down the Sword, where he analyzes these alleged anti-Semitic verses. And here's a Christian scholar that says there's nothing anti-Semitic in the Quran. And in fact, if you really want to talk about what's anti-Semitic, look at the Gospels, where Jesus Christ refers to Jews as the children of Satan. But on a deeper level, the Quran, yes, it mentions Jews because it calls the Jews the people of the book. This is an honored station. It goes on to say that Jews will attain paradise. Why would you offer paradise to people who are despised, or people who are considered evil? Absolutely not. And in fact, the most harsh language in the Quran and in the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, aren't for the Jews. It's for the Muslim clerics. The Prophet said that in the latter days, the Muslim clerics would be the worst creatures on the face of the earth. They will create chaos and disorder. I wrote a Time magazine article about this, and if you just search my name and Time, you can find it, where I really analyze this myth of anti-Semitism in Islam and show how flawed it actually is. In fact, and I'll close with this, the Prophet of Islam actively fought to end anti-Semitism. If you look at the Constitution of Medina, he wrote in there specifically, "No Jew shall ever be wronged for being a Jew. The Jews and Muslims are one people of the state of Medina." You don't do that if you have animosity. You don't put that in writing if you have animosity. You put that in writing because that's your firm conviction that Jews and Muslims are equal human beings.
So that just got to go. I don't know if this one's true. Maybe you can help us with this one. I promised I'd ask questions, even no matter how they were. I remember when we had a wee chat. So apparently, Muhammad pulled down the pants for children, checked to see if they'd hit puberty, and if they had, he killed them.
Completely false. Completely false.
I promised I'd read them all. I've got to be... Because when I interviewed Tommy Robinson not that long ago, I was told that I either wasn't supportive enough of him or I didn't rip him to pieces enough, because we try and run it down the line with our guests, whether I agree, disagree, or anything else. So that sometimes means putting odd questions.
You know what's fascinating about Tommy Robinson is that he'll troll me on Twitter, and every time I'll get him to admit that Ahmadi Muslims are peaceful. And he admits it, and he does it openly. You can find his tweets about that. And then when I point out to him that we uphold the Quran 100%, and we uphold the life of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, 100%, and that's why we're peaceful, we have a proven model based on following the Quran, then he gets very quiet. And that's what I mean, that people can have their empty theories all they want, but you can't argue with a proven model. We have a proven model of over 130 years. Let alone Muslim communities, find me any religious organization or government that has a 130-year track record of absolute peace. You won't, because it doesn't exist. This is not an accident, and you would need to be detached from reality to think that this is an accident. This is because we follow that Islam 100% that the Prophet of Islam taught.
Maybe we'll have to try and get you and Tommy together in an interview one day. That'd be quite interesting.
Great.
Because I think sometimes, although he has some very strong opinions on Islam, he's perhaps not the racist monster he's painted as.
I'll say this about Tommy, that when he Muslim clerics who are trying to cover up abuses by Muslims, I got to agree with him. I mean, I think Muslim leadership has done a horrible job. Where I draw the line with him is when he tries to claim that Islam somehow motivates this. He's speaking from a position of ignorance and a position that's just indefensible. But where he where he cherry picks and ignores abuses by white Christian men or white supremacists, and by the way, I distinguish between white supremacists and Christians. But where he cherry picks, that's also where I draw the line. If you're going to condemn injustice, you need to condemn all injustice. You can't just cherry pick off of one particular demographic and ignore all the others.
Well, he does claim that he's anti-all extremism, but he does seem predominantly preoccupied.
Yeah, he does.
With one in particular. Couple of quick fire ones. What is the punishment for apostasy?
In Islam, there's no punishment for apostasy.
So there is no automatic death sentence for apostasy in Islam?
Absolutely not.
So that is a perversion of Islam?
Complete perversion. It's complete distortion. The Quran addresses apostasy dozens of times and repeatedly says that each person has their own choice between them and God. And in fact, it goes out of its way on numerous occasions to condemn not the apostate, but to condemn the person who is oppressing somebody else's conscience. The Quran is clear. La ikraha fi din. There shall be no compulsion in religion. The right has been made distinct from the wrong. And those, it goes on to say, the next verse goes on to say, that those who oppose God are going to be held accountable only by God. No human being has any right to interfere on God's domain.
So, I guess, I mean, so what, not that you're, what the hell went wrong with all the Islamic republics and Islamic countries? And they're so repressive and seem fascinated with death. I mean, even going back historically, if we look at Afghanistan, which, we've all had a try at invading over the years and failed miserably. But all the sort of atrocities we attribute to modern Islamic terrorism have just been part of what humanity's always done anyway. It's been recorded that if you were ever caught in that part of the world, just shoot yourself. And yet we look back a couple of 1,500 years, 1,000 years ago, which was a very different age of people living together. Yes, there were some feudal systems in terms of you didn't have these rights that these citizens had, but those were the times. What happened? What went wrong? That suddenly the only Islam that the rest of us are exposed to or see, despite media cherry picking, it's so death oriented to us.
Well, that's why I appreciate media personalities like yourself that give us a platform to have this discussion, because very few media people are. I mean, there's some very prominent on the liberal and the conservative side that will scream, where are these Muslims that will speak out against this? But then you'll say, well, let me come on your show, and they'll say, no, sorry, we're not interested. That doesn't get good ratings. So, what went wrong is what I described, that you had corrupt clerics, and then you had Western powers that were supporting these clerics. Like, I'll give you a perfectly good example. Dictator Zia-ul-Haq, who implemented the death for apostasy laws in Pakistan, was funded and supported by the U.S. government. Why would the U.S. government support such a dictator? The Taliban in Afghanistan, for example, the first time the textbooks in the schools translated jihad to mean holy war against the infidel, whatever that means, guess who funded those textbooks? It was U.S. tax dollars that were printed in the University of Nebraska. Hillary Clinton even testified this before Congress. So you have a very toxic combination of corrupt and greedy Muslim leaders like Osama bin Laden, Saddam Hussein, Hosni Mubarak, Dictator Zia-ul-Haq, Assad, and then you have a opportunistic Western interventionism policy, and it's a very toxic result, a very painful result. And the people who are suffering the most, remember, up to 97% of the people killed by these terrorists are who? They're Muslims. And so, I mean, Muslims of all sects. So I'm not trying to even focus on any one sect. Shia, Sunni, Ahmadi, Ismaili. All these Muslims are suffering the most at the hands of these terrorists. Nobody wants these terrorists gone more than Muslims. But it's going to require a stop to the arms trade. It's going to require countries that focus on justice and religious freedom and freedom of conscience, including for atheists. And it's going to require dialogue. Demonization and these quick hit, let me try to sell a book to make money on, I think Tommy's book is Learn the Quran in Minutes. And I burst out laughing at that because the Quran was revealed over 23 years to the Prophet of Islam. It took him that long to be taught the Quran by God. But Tommy's going to somehow teach us in minutes? Are you mad? I mean, it's utter nonsense that people are even following this
type of... It will sell very well, though.
Unfortunately, because hate sells. Very well.
Of course it does.
Bigotry sells.
If it bleeds, it leads.
That's exactly right.
Those are the rules.
That's exactly right.
There are actually loads more of questions, but I've kept you a lot longer than I said I was going to.
Well, we should do this again.
Well, definitely. I was about to bring that up. We should definitely go over this again. I'm sure there are lots more questions people have. And let's say, as I don't like saying atheist because it makes it sound like I'm part of some club. I just don't believe in God. I'm not part of a movement. I think was it Neil deGrasse Tyson said there is no word for someone that doesn't play golf. That's how I feel. I'm supportive of everyone believing in anything they wish, providing they don't impact my life negatively.
That's exactly what Islam teaches, actually.
I don't mind them offending me. I'm great with being offended. Just don't harm me. And I think one of the problems we got like, if you the Charlie Hebdo case, everything right now to do with Islam leads people to seeing that black masked figure cutting your throat.
Sure.
This isn't going to be fixed anytime soon, because we're going to see another war in the Middle East very soon, I believe.
Fortunately, yeah.
I think it's unavoidable, so we're going to see an escalation. Just as Daesh look to be weakened, we're going to strengthen them again.
Yeah.
And probably supply them with more white Toyota trucks and arms, but that's another story. But I really want to say thank you for sharing your thoughts on this. I think it's fascinating that what we see in the West as Islam is, according to yourselves, a perversion of the true faith rather than yours being a reformation of the religion. It reminds me that a friend of mine who converted to Islam says he reverted to Islam, not converted. Sure. So I found it absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
No, thank you for having me. And for what it's worth, if your listeners want to ask me questions, they can follow me at Muslim IQ on Twitter or at my author page on Facebook. But let's keep the dialogue going and check out our True Islam education campaign at trueislam.com and sign up as a Muslim ally. Let's fight this
social media,
Andy.
Social media, Andy's been putting your links out and everything as we've been talking. Again, an absolute pleasure having you on the show. Look forward to speaking to you again, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, my friend.
Take care.